The building is called the Hellinger-Voss Tower, and most people who work in the city have never heard of it, which is the first thing that should tell you something. It sits on a block downtown that doesn't get much foot traffic after 6 in the evening, hemmed in on 3 sides by older office buildings whose tenants left a long time ago, and on the 4th side by a narrow service alley that smells like wet cardboard year-round. From the street it looks like any other mid-century commercial high-rise. 41 stories of pale stone and tinted glass, a revolving door at the front, a loading bay tucked around the corner. There's no sign. Just a brass plate beside the entrance that reads Hellinger-Voss in a serif that hasn't been fashionable since the 60s. And below that, in smaller letters, established 1958. I took the job in the spring, almost 2 years ago now. I had been laid off from a logistics company that had quietly been bleeding money for 3 quarters, and the severance was the kind that doesn't last long if you have a lease and a car payment and the bad habit of buying lunch instead of packing it. I applied to maybe 60 things. Most never wrote back. The Hellinger-Voss listing came through one of those staffing agencies that places people into the kinds of positions nobody talks about at parties: building security, freight handling, custodial work, that sort of thing. The listing said, night elevator operator, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week, full benefits after 90 days. The pay was almost double what I'd been making in logistics. There was a phone number to call. I remember thinking when I called that it had to be a mistake. Buildings haven't had elevator operators in 50 years. Even hotels with the old caged elevators just have a guy in a vest who pushes the button for tourists who want the photograph. But the woman on the phone, who introduced herself only as Mrs. Adler, didn't sound like she was running a tourist attraction. She sounded like a woman who had been answering phones in the same office for 30 years and had developed the kind of voice that lets you know exactly how little patience she has left. She asked me 3 questions. Did I have a clean record? Did I have any chronic medical conditions, particularly anything that affected my hearing or balance? Did I understand that the position required strict adherence to procedure and absolute discretion regarding the building's tenants? I said yes to all 3. She told me to come in for an interview at 4 the following afternoon and to use the side entrance on Crandall Street because the main lobby was reserved for tenants and their guests. I wanted to describe the lobby because it matters later. When I came in through the side door, I expected something stripped down. A service corridor, maybe, but the side entrance opened into the same lobby as the main one. It was a long room with a vaulted ceiling and floors of dark green marble, veined with something that looked almost gold under the right light. There were 2 elevator banks on the east wall, each with 3 sets of brass doors, and a single elevator on the west wall, set apart from the others, with doors of a darker, almost black brass, and a small brass plaque above it that I couldn't read from across the room. There was no front desk in the conventional sense. There was instead a wooden booth, the kind you used to see in old hotels where the concierge would sit and answer questions, and inside the booth was a man in a gray uniform reading a newspaper. He didn't look up when I came in. I didn't yet know that this was Mr. Petrak, the day shift operator, and that he wouldn't speak to me for almost 3 months. Mrs. Adler's office was on the 2nd floor, accessed by a door behind the booth. She was probably 65, very thin, with hair the color of unpolished silver pulled back into a low knot. Her office had no windows. There was a framed photograph on her desk of a building I didn't recognize, taken at what looked like dusk, and a green-shaded banker's lamp, and a typewriter, an actual typewriter. She conducted the interview the way I imagine people conducted interviews in 1962. She asked me about my work history, my reliability, my willingness to work alone for long stretches. She asked if I had family in the city, and when I said no, only a sister 3 states over. Something in her face seemed to soften by a measurable degree, though her voice did not change. She told me that the position had been vacant for 2 months and that the previous night operator had retired. She used the word retired with a small pause before it that I noticed at the time and then forgot for a long while. Then she explained the work. The Hellinger-Voss Tower had 3 elevator banks. The East Bank, with its 6 elevators, served floors 1 through 28, which were occupied by ordinary commercial tenants, law firms, an accounting practice, a small private bank, a couple of medical offices, a publisher of legal reference books. Those elevators were automatic, the kind anyone can operate, and during the day they handled the bulk of the building's traffic. The second elevator bank, also on the east wall but separated from the others by a marble partition, contained 2 elevators that served floors 29 through 40, which were occupied by what Mrs. Adler called the residential tenants. She didn't elaborate on who they were. Those 2 elevators were also automatic, but were keycard restricted. Only residents could access those floors. And then there was the west elevator, the black bronze one. That one, she said, was the operator's elevator, and it served the entire building, including floors that were not on the public directory. She slid a single sheet of paper across the desk to me. It was a list of floor numbers typed on her typewriter, with annotations in the right-hand column. Most of the floors had nothing beside them. Floors I recognized as commercial tenants were marked Standard Access. The residential floors were marked Key Access, Resident Request Only. Below the residential floors, after floor 40, was a line for floor 41, marked Mechanical and Roof. Restricted. And below that, separated by a ruled line drawn carefully in black ink, was a short list of additional floor numbers I had not seen anywhere on the building's signage. Sub-basement 2, sub-basement 3, and 3 other floors, identified only by letters, floor M, floor R, and floor C. Beside all 5 of these entries, in the right-hand column was the same annotation, repeated 5 times. Do not stop, do not open, do not acknowledge. I looked at it for a while. Mrs. Adler waited. I asked her, as evenly as I could, what was on those floors. She said, in the voice of someone reciting a sentence she had recited many times, that the operator was not required to know what was on those floors, only to refrain from stopping at them, opening the doors at them, or acknowledging any signal that originated from them. I asked what kind of signal. She said the elevator panel might, on certain nights, register a call from one of those floors. The panel would light up. There might also be an audible chime. The operator was to ignore the call, continue past the floor, and complete whatever transit had been requested by an authorized rider. She said this in the same tone in which she had told me where to find the time clock and how to log my hours. I almost didn't take the job. I want to make that clear. I sat there with the paper in my hand, and I thought very carefully about whether I wanted to spend my nights in a building that contained 5 floors I was not permitted to stop at. But I had $832 in my checking account, and rent was due in 11 days. And Mrs. Adler had already told me the position included full benefits after 90 days. And I had a tooth in the back of my mouth that had been hurting for 3 months that I had been ignoring because I couldn't afford to look at it. So I said I understood. I signed the paperwork. She gave me a uniform, dark gray with a black tie, and a brass key on a chain, and a small flashlight, and a cardstock manual that contained, in the same typewritten font, the procedures for operating the west elevator. That was a Thursday. I started the following Monday. The first night I worked, nothing happened. I want to be honest about that. Most nights nothing happens, and that's part of why the job is bearable. or was for a long time. The West Elevator is a beautiful machine. It's almost 100 years old, older than the building it now lives in. Salvaged, Mr. Petrak eventually told me, from a hotel in Pennsylvania that had been demolished in the early 60s. The car is paneled in dark wood, with a velvet bench along the back wall and a brass rail above it. And the controls are a half-circle of polished levers and dials set into a brass console. There are no buttons. You don't press a floor. You turn a wheel to align the floor indicator with the floor you want, and you push a lever forward, and the car begins to move. You can feel the cables working through your feet. You can hear the counterweight sliding past in the shaft. It's a physical machine in a way that modern elevators are not, and after the first week I understood why the job still existed. The West Elevator could not be made automatic. It would have required gutting the entire mechanism. The tenants who used it, the ones who lived above the 28th floor, did not want it gutted, so there had to be a person. My riders that first night were 3. A man in his 60s in a long coat who got on at the lobby and asked, in an accent I couldn't quite place, for the 34th floor. He didn't look at me the entire ride. A woman, maybe 40, who got on at 31 with a small dog under her arm and rode down to the lobby and walked out the side door to a waiting car. And a younger man in his 30s, who got on at the lobby at 3 in the morning carrying a leather case and asked for the 38th floor, and who tipped me $20 when he got off and said, "Thank you, friend," in the voice of a man who used the word friend to mean something he didn't want to say out loud. Nothing called from the restricted floors. The panel stayed dark. I read most of a paperback. At 7 a.m., Mr. Petrak arrived to take the day shift, nodded at me without speaking, and I went home. The second week, the panel registered its first restricted call. I had been told to expect this, and I had told myself I was prepared. I was wrong, but only in the way that you're always wrong when you imagine something in advance. The call came at 12:40 in the morning. I was alone in the car at the lobby level, the doors closed, waiting. I had been instructed to keep the doors closed when the car was idle, because an open elevator at street level invited foot traffic that didn't belong, and because the lobby's main desk, meaning Mr. Petrak's booth, which was unmanned at night, was not equipped to screen visitors after hours. So I sat on the velvet bench and I read, and the panel chimed. The chime was not a chime. It was a small, dull bell sound, almost like a kitchen timer at the end of its run, and at the same time a small amber light came on at the top of the panel. The light corresponded to a floor indicator. The indicator read C. I sat very still. I had read the manual several times by then. The manual said, "When a restricted call is received, the operator will not respond. The operator will continue any current transit. If the operator is idle, the operator will remain idle. The call will eventually clear itself, typically within 4 to 6 minutes. Under no circumstances will the operator move the car toward the floor of origin. Under no circumstances will the operator open the doors at any floor while a restricted call is active." I waited. The light stayed on. I counted seconds in my head, which is a habit I picked up as a kid waiting for things, and I got to about 140 before the bell rang again. The same dull tone. The amber light next to C did not change, but a second light came on. This one beside the indicator marked M2 calls, both restricted, both lit at the same time. The manual had not described 2 simultaneous calls. I sat with the paperback open in my lap, and I watched both lights, and I tried to make my breathing match the rhythm I had taught myself for the dentist's chair. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. I noticed that my mouth had gone dry. I noticed that my left hand had begun, without my permission, to grip the brass rail behind the bench. The car was perfectly still. The shaft was perfectly silent. There was no indication anywhere that anything was happening, except for the two amber lights, and the small smell of something that had not been there a minute before, which I can only describe as the smell of cold metal that had been handled by hands that were not warm. After what I later determined to be about 6 minutes, both lights went out at the same instant, with a single soft click. The panel was dark. The bell did not ring again. At 1:15, a man got on at the lobby and asked for the 32nd floor, and I took him there, and the rest of the night was uneventful. When I got home that morning, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with a cup of coffee I did not drink. I thought about quitting. I thought about going back to Mrs. Adler and telling her I had reconsidered. But I also thought about the $832 and the tooth and the rent. And I thought about the fact that nothing had actually happened. The lights had come on. The lights had gone off. I had followed the procedure. The procedure had worked. The building had a system, and the system was designed to keep me on one side of something, and as long as I followed the system, I was on the safe side. That's how I framed it to myself. That's how everyone in that building, I think, framed it to themselves. There is a system. The system works. You stay on your side. I worked there for 11 more months before anything happened that I couldn't fold into that framework. In those 11 months, I learned the rhythms of the building. I learned that the residential tenants were almost all elderly, almost all wealthy in a way I didn't have vocabulary for, and almost all the kind of people who did not make eye contact with staff. I learned their names from the way they signed the night log, which I was required to keep for any rider who used the west elevator after midnight. There was Mr. Calden on 33, who never spoke and always tipped exactly $5. There was Mrs. Veriest on 36, who had a small white dog and who, on the rare occasions she rode at night, would speak to the dog the entire ride in a language I did not recognize. There was a couple on 38, the Linzers, who I only ever saw together, and who, when they rode, stood on opposite sides of the car and did not look at each other, or at me. There was a man on the 40th floor whose name I never learned because he never signed the log, and who Mrs. Adler had told me, on my first day, was an exception to the signing rule. He rode perhaps once a month. He was tall and thin, in his 50s, with hair that was completely white, and he wore the kind of suit that you don't buy off a rack. He always rode alone. He always rode down, never up, which meant he was already in the building when my shift began and gone before it ended. He never spoke to me except on 3 occasions in those first 11 months, to say good evening as he stepped out into the lobby. Each time he said it, I felt, without being able to say why, that I had been examined and dismissed. I learned that the restricted calls came in patterns. Floor C lit up most often, 2 or 3 times a week, almost always between midnight and 2 a.m. Floor M lit perhaps once a week, almost always between 3 and 4. Floor R was rarer. In those 11 months, I saw it light maybe a dozen times, and only ever in the last hour before dawn. The 2 sub-basements, SB2 and SB3, almost never lit. I saw SB2 light twice in 11 months. I never saw SB3 light at all. I learned that the calls had texture. The bell was always the same dull tone, but the lights themselves seemed to behave differently depending on which floor they came from. Floor C's light was steady, almost patient. Floor M's flickered slightly, the way a fluorescent tube flickers when it's near the end. Floor R's light was the brightest, the amber so saturated it almost looked orange, and it pulsed faintly, as though something was breathing on the other end. I started, against my better judgment, to think of the floors as having personalities. I never said this out loud to anyone, because there was no one to say it to. I learned about Mr. Petrak. Slowly. He was not friendly, but he was not unfriendly either. He was a man who had decided a long time ago that the people he worked with were not the people he was going to spend his social attention on. He had been the day operator at Hellinger-Voss for 31 years when I started. He had taken over from a man named Devereaux, who had taken over from a man named Hollis, who had taken over from the original operator, a man named Bauer, who had been hired the year the building opened. Mr. Petrak knew this lineage the way some people know their own genealogy. He told it to me finally, in the 11th week of my employment, while we were standing in the lobby during the shift change, both of us watching a maintenance crew in coveralls roll a piece of equipment across the marble floor toward the freight elevator at the rear of the building. He said, without preamble, "You've had restricted calls." I said I had. He said, "How many at once is the most you've had?" I said 2. He nodded, the way a doctor nods when you describe a symptom he was expecting to hear. He said, "If you ever get 3 at once, you call Adler. Doesn't matter what time. There's a number on the back of your manual. You call her." I asked what happened when there were 3 at once. He looked at me for a long time. He had pale eyes, gray-blue, set deep in a face that had been weathered by things other than weather. He said, "I've been here 31 years and it's happened twice. Once in '86 and once in 2004. Both times Adler came down within the hour and she sat in the booth for the rest of the night and nothing happened. So I don't know what happens. I just know what we do." I asked him if he had ever stopped at one of the restricted floors. He didn't answer immediately. He watched the maintenance crew finish loading their equipment and the freight elevator close behind them, and then he said, "No, and I don't know anyone who has, and I don't want to know anyone who has." Then he picked up his newspaper and went back to the booth and did not speak to me again for another 4 months. That conversation has stayed with me for reasons I'll get to. At the time, I took it as confirmation that I was inside a real system, with real protocols, that had been operating for decades, and that my job was simply to be one more reliable component in it. That was a comforting framework. I held on to it as long as I could. The first thing that broke the framework happened on a Tuesday in late February of my 2nd year. The night had been ordinary up to that point. I had taken Mrs. Varys down at 11:40 for what she called her constitutional, a 10-minute walk around the block with her dog, after which she had returned and I had taken her back up to 36. I had taken a young man, a guest, not a tenant, down from 38 at 12:15, and I had logged him out as he left through the main door. The lobby had been still since then. It was 1:50 in the morning. The panel was dark. The bell rang. The amber light came on. It was the C floor. I noted the time, as I always did, in a small notebook I kept for myself, separate from the official log. I had started keeping it after about 4 months on the job, partly out of boredom and partly out of the slow accumulation of a feeling I did not have a name for. I had been told not to acknowledge the calls. I had not been told not to record them. The notebook was in the inside pocket of my jacket. I wrote 1:50 a.m. C single. I waited. The light stayed on. At 1:54, the bell rang again. The amber light beside C did not change, but the indicator dial above the panel, the brass dial that showed the current position of the car in the shaft, moved. I want to be very precise about this. The car was idle at the lobby. The dial should have read L. The dial had read L all night. I had glanced at it, idly, perhaps 30 times in the last 3 hours, the way you glance at a clock. At 1:54, With the car still standing perfectly still and silent at the lobby level, the dial moved from L to a position roughly 2/3 of the way around its arc, where it stopped. I looked at where it had stopped. There was no number printed at that position. The numbered positions on the dial corresponded to the building's 28 commercial floors, the residential floors 29 through 40, and the mechanical floor 41. Past 41, the dial continued for a short additional arc that, on a normal night, did not move, because no normal floor existed there. The dial had moved into that section. It was pointing at a position that had no number. The car had not moved. I could feel that. The car was exactly where I was sitting in it. The bench was steady beneath me. The cables outside the car were silent, but the dial was telling me that the car was somewhere else. I sat for a moment with the notebook in my hand. I wrote 154. Dial moved with car stationary, position unmarked, between 41 and end of arc. The bell rang a third time. This time the amber light next to C went out and a different light came on. The indicator marked R. I had never had an R call this early in the night. R always came in the last hour before dawn. I noted this. I wrote 154, R call, off pattern. The dial began to move again, slowly, smoothly, the way it moved when the car itself was moving. But the car was still not moving. I watched the brass needle slide back through the unmarked arc, past 41, past 40, past the residential floors, past the commercial floors, all the way down to L. It came to rest exactly where it had been before, with a small, audible click that I had heard hundreds of times before when the car arrived at the lobby. At the same instant, the doors opened. I had not pushed the lever. I had not turned the wheel. The doors of the west elevator had opened on their own, into the empty marble lobby, at 1:54 in the morning, with no rider in the car and no rider waiting outside. The lobby was empty. The booth was empty. The east elevators were dark behind their brass doors. The light from the lobby's brass sconces fell across the green marble in the same pattern it had been falling all night. There was nothing different about the lobby. There was nothing waiting in the lobby. The doors had opened onto nothing. I stood up. I don't know why I stood up. The manual did not address this situation. The manual addressed restricted calls. It did not address the doors opening on their own. I stood in the center of the car and I looked out into the lobby and I waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. After perhaps 30 seconds, the doors closed, again on their own, with the same soft hydraulic sigh they made when I closed them with the lever. The amber light next to R went out. The panel was dark. The dial read L. The car was idle. I sat back down on the bench. I wrote in the notebook, 1:54:30. Doors opened without command. Lobby empty. No rider, no visible cause. Doors closed at approximately 1:55. Panel cleared. Then I sat in the car and I waited for the rest of my shift, and nothing else happened. And at 7 a.m. Mr. Petrak arrived, and I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting. He did not ask me to repeat anything. When I was finished, he said, "Did you call Adler?" I said I hadn't. The procedure was for 3 simultaneous calls. This had been a sequence of single calls with an anomaly in the middle. He said, "Call her now." I called her from the lobby phone. She picked up on the second ring at 7:02 in the morning, and she did not sound as if she had been asleep. I told her what had happened. She listened the way Petrak had listened, without interrupting, and when I was finished, she said, "Thank you. I'd like you to come in an hour early tonight. 10 o'clock. Use the side entrance." That was all. I went home. I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote out, in much greater detail than the notebook entries, everything I could remember about the previous night, including the smells I had not noticed at the time and only remembered in retrospect. There had been, when the doors opened, a faint smell, not the cold metal smell that accompanied the restricted calls. Something else, something organic, but very dry. The way a closet smells when you open it after a long time and there are old wool coats inside that haven't been worn in a decade. That smell had come into the car when the doors opened, and it had left when the doors closed, and I had not consciously registered it until I was sitting at my kitchen table 6 hours later. I went in at 10 that night. Mrs. Adler was waiting in the lobby, in the booth, wearing a coat over her usual dark dress. She looked at me when I came in, which was unusual. She generally did not look at staff directly. She said, "Walk with me." We took the west elevator. She got in with me and she stood beside the controls and she said, "Take us to 34. I turned the wheel. I pushed the lever. The car began to rise. She watched the panel as we rose. At the 29th floor, she said quietly, "Slow down at 34. I want to step off for a moment." I slowed the car. We came to a stop at 34. The doors opened onto the residential corridor. Dark green carpet, paneled walls, brass sconces every 15 feet. She stepped off. She walked perhaps 10 feet down the corridor and stopped at a section of wall that, to me, looked exactly like every other section of wall. She put her hand against the wall, palm flat, and stood there for perhaps half a minute. Then she walked back to the elevator and stepped in. The doors closed. She said, "Take us to the lobby." We rode down in silence. When we reached the lobby and the doors opened, she stepped out and she turned to me and she said, "I don't think you did anything wrong last night. I want you to understand that. The procedure is the procedure. You followed it. What happened was not a result of anything you did or did not do. Do you understand?" I said I did, although I didn't. She said, "There are nights when the building behaves in ways that the procedure does not fully address. On those nights, your only obligation is to remain in the car, remain in your uniform, and not respond to anything that does not present itself as an authorized rider. An authorized rider is a person who is physically present in the lobby, who is recognizable to you as a tenant, or as the guest of a tenant, who speaks to you, and who states a destination. Anyone or anything else is not an authorized rider. Do you understand?" I said I did. She said, "If, on any future shift, the doors open without your command, you will not exit the car. You will not look out of the car. You will not speak. You will close the doors as soon as they will respond to the lever. If they will not respond to the lever, you will sit on the bench. You will face the rear of the car, and you will remain there until the doors close on their own. This may take several minutes. It may take longer. You will not turn around. You will not speak. Do you understand?" I said I did. My mouth had gone dry again. The cold metal smell was not in the lobby, but I felt the memory of it on the back of my tongue. She said, "One other thing. If at any point you hear someone in the lobby calling your name, and you have not previously given your name to that person, you will not respond. You will not answer. You will not acknowledge that you have heard, even if the voice is familiar to you, even if it is the voice of someone you know. Do you understand?" I had not at that point given my name to anyone in the building except Mrs. Adler herself, Mr. Petrak, and the staffing agency. I said I understood. She said, "Good. Your shift begins in 50 minutes. Mr. Petrak will stay until 11 if you'd like company until then." She walked back toward her office. I stood in the lobby for a long time with the brass key in my pocket and the manual in my jacket and the notebook against my ribs, and I tried to decide whether what she had told me was a comfort or a warning. I decided, eventually, that it was both, and that the difference between the two had stopped mattering. I worked another 4 months without incident. The restricted calls came at their usual rhythms. The doors did not open on their own. I rode tenants up and down. I logged them in and out. The dial behaved. The bell behaved. I told myself, as the weeks accumulated, that whatever had happened that night in February had been an aberration, a glitch in a system that had been running for almost 70 years and was entitled to glitch occasionally. I started sleeping again. I made an appointment with a dentist and finally had the tooth looked at. It was a cracked molar, fixable, and I paid for it out of pocket because the building's benefits had kicked in, and I was no longer afraid of the bill. I ate lunch at a diner near my apartment 3 days a week. I called my sister on Sundays. I read paperbacks in the car, mostly mysteries, some history. I was, for those 4 months, a man with a strange job who was nonetheless living a life. I want to say that because I want to be clear that I was not a person who had become unbalanced by the work. I was a person who had adapted to it. There is a difference, and the difference matters. The second incident happened on a Thursday in late June. It was hot that night. The kind of June heat that doesn't dissipate after sundown. The building's air conditioning was working, but the lobby still felt warmer than it usually did, the marble holding the day's heat the way stone does. My shift began at 11. The first 3 hours were ordinary. Mr. Calden came down at 11:30 to put a letter in the mailbox at the corner and went back up at 11:40. The Linzers came down at 12:20 and got into a car at the curb. A guest of the man on 38, a woman in her 30s with very short hair and a gray coat, came down at 1:15 and left through the side door. Between rides I read. The panel was dark. At 2:03, a man came in through the main entrance. I want to describe him carefully. He was perhaps 40. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that was well cut but not new. He had no overcoat, which was not unusual in June. He was carrying a brown leather briefcase. His shoes were polished. He walked across the lobby with the unhurried, slightly weary step of a man who has worked late and is going home. He came to the west elevator. He stopped in front of the doors. He looked at me through the open doors with a small, polite smile, and he said, 36, please. 36 was Mrs. Variest's floor. There was no other tenant on 36. Mrs. Variest did not have guests. In the 14 months I had been working there, I had never once taken anyone to 36 other than Mrs. Variest herself. I looked at him. He looked at me. His face was perfectly composed, perfectly ordinary. He had brown eyes and a slightly receding hairline and the kind of mouth that, in repose, settled into a small, natural smile. He looked like a man who sold insurance. He looked like someone's uncle. I said, "I'm sorry, sir. May I have your name for the log?" He said, without hesitation, "Andrew Linzer." The Linzers were on 38. Andrew Linzer was the husband, a man in his 60s, gray-haired, slight. The Linzers had left the building over an hour and a half ago. Neither of them had returned. The man standing in front of me was not Andrew Linzer. I do not know how I kept my face still. I want to be honest. I think it was only because I had been sitting in that car for 14 months learning to keep my face still through 100 small strangenesses, and the muscles had gotten used to the work. I did not change my expression. I said, "I'm sorry, sir. I don't have you on the resident list for 36. Are you a guest of a tenant on that floor?" he said, still with a small smile. "I'm a guest of Mrs. Variest. She's expecting me." Mrs. Variest had been asleep for 2 hours. I had taken her up myself at 11:50 after her constitutional. She had told me, as she stepped off the car, that she would not be needing the elevator again that night. She always told me this. She had never had a guest at any hour, let alone 2 in the morning. I said, I'd need to call up to confirm. 1 moment, please. I reached for the lobby phone, which sat in a small alcove beside the elevator on a short cord. I lifted the receiver. I did not dial. I held the receiver to my ear, and I pretended to be listening to a ringing line. And I watched the man. He did not move. He stood exactly where he had been standing. His expression did not change. He did not look impatient. He did not look at the phone in my hand, or at the alcove, or at anything else in the lobby. He looked at me. He looked at me with a small, polite smile, and his eyes did not blink. I do not mean that he was staring intently. I mean that in the perhaps 40 seconds that I held the receiver to my ear and pretended to listen, his eyelids did not move once. I watched for it. I watched for it because the longer I held the receiver, the more I became aware that something in his stillness was not the stillness of a patient man, but the stillness of something doing an impression of a patient man. His chest rose and fell at intervals, but the intervals were not the intervals of a person breathing. They were too even, too spaced, like a metronome someone had set and then walked away from. I said, into the dead receiver, "Varist, I'm sorry to disturb you. I have a gentleman in the lobby who says he's a guest of yours. A Mr. Linzer." I paused. I nodded. I said, "Of course. I'll send him up directly. Good night, ma'am." I hung up the phone. I stepped back into the car. I said, "She's expecting you, sir. Step in, please." He stepped in. He stood beside me, on my left, facing the doors. He did not put his hand on the brass rail. He did not set his briefcase down. He held the briefcase by the handle, against his thigh, and he stood, and he did not move. I closed the doors. I turned the wheel to 36. I pushed the lever forward. I have asked myself many times since that night why I did what I did next. I think it was because I understood, in some part of me that operates faster than thought, that if I took him to 36, the doors would open into Mrs. Variest's corridor and he would step off the car, and Mrs. Variest, who was a small woman in her late 70s, who lived alone with a small dog, would not survive whatever was about to happen. I could not call the police. I could not call Mrs. Adler from the moving car. I could not stop the car between floors and hold him there, because he was standing 2 feet from me and I had no way to know what he would do. But Mrs. Adler had told me, that night 4 months earlier, that an authorized rider was a person who was physically present in the lobby, who was recognizable to me as a tenant or as the guest of a tenant, who spoke to me and who stated a destination. The man beside me had stated a destination. He was physically present, but he was not, by any honest measure I could apply, a guest of a tenant. He had given a name that did not belong to him. He was, by the definition Mrs. Adler had given me, not an authorized rider. The car was passing the 20th floor. I had perhaps 15 seconds. I let the lever come back to neutral. The car slowed. I turned the wheel. And I want to describe this part exactly, because I have thought about it more than anything else that has happened to me at that job. I turned the wheel past 41, past the unmarked arc, into the section of the dial that contained the restricted floors. I turned it to C. I pushed the lever forward. The car began to descend. Not toward the lobby, past the lobby, past sub-basement 1, which was a storage and mechanical floor I had visited exactly twice in the company of a maintenance crew. Past sub-basement 2. The car continued to descend. The dial slid past the marked floors and into the unmarked arc and came to rest, finally, with a small click, at a position labeled only with the letter C. The doors did not open. I had not pushed the door lever. The car had stopped. The dial was at C. The amber light above the panel. The light that, on every other night of my employment, had glowed to indicate a restricted call, was not lit. There had been no call from C. I had simply taken the car there. The man beside me did not react for the first 3 seconds. Then, very slowly, he turned his head and looked at me. The small, polite smile was gone. His face was not angry. It was not afraid. It was not anything. It was the face of a person who has been interrupted while doing a task and is recalculating. He said, in a voice that was identical to the voice he had used in the lobby, "This isn't 36. I said, "No, sir." He said, "I asked for 36. I said, "Yes, sir." He looked at the doors. The doors were closed. He looked at the brass console. He looked at me. He said, "Open the doors." I said, "I can't, sir. Not on this floor." He said, "Open the doors." I looked at the door lever. I did not touch it. I looked at the panel. The panel was dark. The dial was at C. Outside the car, somewhere in the shaft or behind the doors or in the floor we had stopped at, I could hear something. It was not a loud sound. It was the sound of weight shifting. The sound a person makes when they have been standing in one place for a long time and they finally take a step. The man said, a third time, "Open the doors." His voice had not changed. It was perfectly level. The metronome was still running. I did not answer. I sat on the bench. I faced the rear of the car, the way Mrs. Adler had told me to face the rear of the car if the doors opened on their own. I did not turn around. I did not speak. I put my hands on my knees, and I looked at the wood paneling on the back wall of the car, and I counted my breaths. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. Behind me, the man did not move. I could feel him not moving. I could feel the briefcase still in his hand. The metronome breathing continued for perhaps a minute, and then it stopped. Not slowed, stopped, the way you stop a mechanical thing by switching it off. The sound outside the doors got louder. It was not footsteps. It was something more like the sound of a heavy curtain being drawn back along a brass rod, except that the curtain was very large and the rod was very long. The sound went on for perhaps 15 seconds, and then it ended in a soft thud, the way a curtain ends when its weight settles against the wall. The doors opened. I did not turn around. I want to say that again because I want to be clear about the only thing I did right that night. I did not turn around. I sat on the bench and I faced the back wall of the car and I looked at the wood paneling, and I counted, and I did not turn around. I do not know what was on the other side of those doors. I do not know what floor C is. I have theories. I have had 2 years to develop theories, and I will not write them down, because writing them down would make them more real than they need to be. I will say only what I observed, and what I observed was this. The doors were open for approximately 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, the air in the car changed. The temperature dropped. Not dramatically, but noticeably, perhaps 10 degrees. The cold metal smell was very strong. The dry wool smell from the February incident was also there, underneath the metal. There was a third smell I had not encountered before, which I will not try to describe, because describing it makes my hands shake even now. During those 4 minutes, the man behind me did not breathe. I want to be clear that I do not mean he held his breath. I mean that the metronome stopped, and it did not start again. The sound of his presence, the small ambient sound that any person's body makes simply by being in a room, the rustle of fabric, the shift of weight, the faint warmth of breath. That sound was absent. There was a place in the car where he had been, and the place was now occupied by something that was not making any sound. At some point during those 4 minutes, the place behind me became empty. I cannot tell you when. I did not turn around. I only know in retrospect that at some point the car contained me and not him, and that the transition from one state to the other was something I did not hear and did not feel, except as a small loosening in the air, the way a room feels when a window has been opened in another part of the building. The doors closed. They closed slowly, with the same hydraulic sigh as always. The amber light above the panel did not come on. The dial stayed at C. I sat on the bench and I counted to 300. Then I stood up and I turned around and the car was empty. The briefcase was on the floor by the doors. It was the only thing left of him, if there had ever been a him. I did not touch it. I turned the wheel back to L. I pushed the lever forward. The car began to rise. It rose smoothly, past the sub-basements, past the lobby, and I let it go past the lobby on purpose, because I needed another minute before I had to look at the lobby again. I took the car up to 20, and I held it there for 30 seconds, and I brought it back down to the lobby. The lobby was empty. The booth was empty. The east elevators were dark. Everything was as it had been at 2:03. I called Mrs. Adler. She arrived in 14 minutes. She was wearing the same coat she had been wearing in February. She did not ask me what had happened in the lobby. She asked me what had happened in the car. I told her. I told her everything, including the part about turning the wheel to C. I expected her to fire me. I expected her to call the police. I expected, if I am honest, to be told that I had broken the procedure and that there were consequences for breaking the procedure that I did not yet understand. She listened the way she always listened, without interrupting. When I was finished, she said, "Where is the briefcase?" I said it was still in the car. She said, "Show me." I took her to the car. The briefcase was where I had left it, by the doors. She looked at it for a long time without picking it up. Then she said, "Leave it. Mr. Petrak will deal with it in the morning." She walked out of the car and across the lobby to the booth, and she sat down in Mr. Petrak's chair, and she said, "I'll sit here for the rest of your shift. Go back to the car. If anyone else comes in, you bring them to me first. You don't take anyone up until I've spoken to them." No one else came in. The shift ended at 7. Mr. Petrak arrived. Mrs. Adler stood up, and the two of them spoke quietly in the booth for perhaps 2 minutes. And then Mr. Petrak nodded, and Mrs. Adler walked toward the back of the lobby and disappeared through a service door I had never seen open before. Mr. Petrak said to me, "Go home, sleep, come back tonight." I went home. I slept 4 hours. I came back. When I came back, the briefcase was gone. The car was clean. The dial worked the way it had always worked. The panel behaved. Mr. Petrak handed off to me without comment. I worked the shift. The shift was uneventful. The shift after that was uneventful. The shift after that was uneventful. I worked for 3 more weeks without incident, and I started to believe again that the system had absorbed the anomaly, the way it had absorbed every other anomaly for almost 70 years, and that I was once again on the safe side of it. Then Mrs. Adler called me into her office on a Friday afternoon, 2 hours before my shift, and told me that she was retiring at the end of the month. She told me this very matter-of-factly. She said she was 68 years old, that she had worked at Hellinger-Voss for 41 years, and that she had decided it was time. She said her replacement, a Mr. Halverson, would be starting on the 1st of August. She said Mr. Halverson had been the building manager at a similar property in another city for 12 years, and was familiar with the kind of work the building required. She said she expected the transition to be smooth. Then she said, I want to give you something before I go." She opened the drawer of her desk and took out an envelope. The envelope was not sealed. She handed it to me. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed on her typewriter, that contained a list of 12 names. I recognized none of them. She said, "Those are the names of the operators who have worked the night shift at this building since 1958, including yours. You are the 13th. The ones with a small mark beside their name are the ones who retired. The ones without a mark are the ones who didn't." I looked at the list. There were 12 names. 3 of them had a small ink mark beside them. 9 of them did not. My name was not on the list, because my name had not yet been added to it. But I understood that it would be added to it eventually, and that there would eventually be a mark beside it or there would not. She said, "I am giving you this, not to frighten you. I am giving you this because I believe you have earned the right to know. The work you do is real work. It matters. It has mattered for a very long time. The people who do it well are people who understand that the procedure is not a set of rules. The procedure is an agreement. The building agrees not to take certain things, and we agree not to give it certain things. Most of the time, both sides of the agreement hold. Occasionally, they don't. When they don't, the operator is the person standing at the boundary. You stood at the boundary in June and you held it. I don't know that I would have held it. I want you to know that I noticed." She took the paper back. She put it in the envelope. She put the envelope back in the drawer. She closed the drawer. She said, "Mr. Halverson is a competent man. I have worked with him before. I trust him to maintain the procedure. I do not, however, know him as well as I know you and Mr. Petrak. If, after I'm gone, you find that the procedure under his management begins to change in ways you do not understand, I want you to call this number." She wrote a number on a small card and gave it to me. "It is my home number. I will not be available during business hours, but I will answer in the evening." I took the card. I put it in my wallet, behind my driver's license, where it has lived ever since. She said, "Good night." I worked her last 2 weeks. I shook her hand on her final day, which was a Wednesday. She left through the side door at 5 in the afternoon, carrying the same small leather bag she had carried every day for, presumably, decades. She did not turn around. I never saw her again. Mr. Halverson started the following Monday. He was, as Mrs. Adler had described him, a competent man. He was perhaps 50. He was tall, balding, with the kind of build that suggested he had played some sport in college and had maintained the discipline of it. He wore a dark suit. He shook my hand on the first day and introduced himself and said he was looking forward to working with me. He said he had read my file and that Mrs. Adler had spoken highly of me. He said he intended, in his first month, to learn the rhythms of the building before making any changes. He did not ask me about the procedure. He did not ask me about the restricted floors. I assumed at the time that this was because he already knew about them and saw no need to discuss them with a subordinate. I now think it was because he did not yet know about them and was waiting to find out. For the first 3 weeks of Mr. Halverson's tenure, nothing changed. The shifts were ordinary. The restricted calls came at their usual rhythms. I followed the procedure. He arrived in the morning at 6:30, half an hour before Petrak, and walked the lobby, and checked the booth, and went up to the office that had been Mrs. Adler's. He left at 5. He was pleasant. He was professional. He did not seem to be the kind of man who would let anything slip. In the 4th week, he started asking questions. The first question came on a Tuesday morning as my shift was ending. He came down to the lobby at 6:45, 10 minutes early, and he stood beside the booth and he watched me write up the night log. When I was finished, he said, "Can I ask you about the panel?" I said, "Of course." He said, "There's a section of the dial, past the mechanical floor, that doesn't correspond to any floor in the building. I noticed it when I was up in the maintenance room with the engineer last week. He couldn't tell me what it was. I wondered if you knew. I'd been preparing for this question for a long time, and I thought I had a good answer ready. But when he asked it, I found that I did not." I said, after a pause, "It's a remnant from when the elevator was originally installed in the building it came from. The dial wasn't recalibrated when it was moved here. It doesn't correspond to anything." He nodded. He said, "Has anyone tried to recalibrate it?" I said, "Not that I know of." He said, He stood there for another moment, looking at the dial through the open doors of the elevator. Then he said, "Well, have a good morning," and he walked back across the lobby. The second question came 2 nights later. He stayed late on a Thursday, which he had not done before, and he was still in his office when I arrived from my shift at 11. He came down to the lobby at 11:15, after I had relieved Mr. Petrak. He stood beside the booth and watched me arrange my paperback and my notebook on the small ledge inside the car. He said, "I noticed something in the records this week." I said, "What's that, sir?" He said, "There's a maintenance log for the west elevator that goes back to 1958, every visit by every engineer for 68 years. It's very thorough. But there's a section in it, every page, where the engineer is supposed to record any anomalies, unscheduled stops, door malfunctions, panel irregularities. That section is empty. On every single page, for 68 years, no engineer has ever recorded an anomaly on this elevator." He looked at me. He waited. I said, "It's a well-built machine, sir." He said, "It is. But no machine that old runs that well for that long without ever having anything go wrong with it." I said, "I couldn't say, sir." He looked at me for another moment. Then he said, "Good night," and he walked out the side door. The third question did not come as a question. It came in the form of an instruction 2 weeks later, in a memo he left in the booth for Mr. Petrak and copied to me. The memo was titled, "Operational Update. West Elevator." It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph thanked us for our service and noted that the building's leadership was committed to maintaining the high standards of operation that had been established under previous management. The second paragraph announced that, beginning the following Monday, all calls received by the West Elevator panel would be logged in a new electronic system, which Mr. Halverson had installed. The third paragraph said that, in the interest of completeness, this would include calls from all floor designations, including those that did not correspond to physically accessible floors, and that the operator was to record each such call in the new system at the time it occurred. I read the memo twice. I put it down on the bench beside me. I stared at the brass console for a long time. Then I took the card out of my wallet, and I went to the lobby phone and I called Mrs. Adler. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was the same voice it had always been. She said, "I assumed I'd be hearing from you eventually." I told her about the memo. She listened without interrupting. When I was finished, she said, "Has he asked you to begin logging the calls yet?" I said, "No, the new procedure started Monday." She said, "I want you to do something for me. I want you to keep working the shift exactly as you have been working it. I want you to follow Mr. Halverson's procedure on paper. I want you to log the calls. I want you to do everything he asks you to do. But I want you to also continue to do everything I asked you to do. The 2 procedures will not, on their face, conflict. He has not yet asked you to acknowledge the calls. He has only asked you to record them. Recording them is not acknowledging them. Do you understand the distinction?" I said I did. She said, "If, at any point, his procedure begins to require you to acknowledge the calls, to respond to them, to take the car to those floors, to open the doors, To do anything other than record their existence? You call me immediately. Day or night. Do you understand? I said I did. She said, there is one other thing. If he tells you that he intends to ride the car himself during your shift, and to take it to one of the unmarked positions on the dial, you do not refuse him. He is your supervisor. You are not in a position to refuse. But you call me before he gets in the car. Do you understand? I said I did. She said, good night. That was 4 months ago. For the first 6 weeks of the new procedure, things were unremarkable. I logged the calls on the small electronic terminal Mr. Halverson had installed in the car. I recorded their times, their floor designations, their durations. I did not respond to them. The panel did not behave any differently than it had behaved before. The dial did not move on its own. The doors did not open. The amber lights came and went at their usual intervals. I logged them, and Mr. Halverson in the morning would download the logs from the terminal and take them upstairs to his office, and the cycle would repeat. In the 7th week, 2 things changed. The first was that the calls became more frequent. Floor C, which had been calling 2 or 3 times a week, began to call every night, sometimes twice a night. Floor M, which had been calling once a week, began to call every other night. Floor R, which had been calling perhaps once a month, began to call once a week. SB2, which I had seen light twice in 14 months, lit 4 times in 7 days. SB3, which I had never seen light at all, lit once at 4:17 in the morning on a Saturday, for 9 seconds. I logged each of these. I did not respond. The second was that Mr. Halverson began to come down to the lobby at night. He started small. He came in at midnight one Tuesday, claiming he had left some papers in his office that he needed for an early meeting. He took the east elevator up. He came back down 10 minutes later, holding a folder, and he stood in the lobby for perhaps a minute, watching the west elevator panel through the open doors of my car. Then he left. He did not speak to me. A week later, he came in at 1:30 on a Thursday morning. He stood in the lobby for nearly 15 minutes, with no apparent purpose, watching the panel. The panel was active that night. It lit twice while he was watching, once at C and once at M. I logged both. He watched me log them. He did not speak. He left at 1:45. The week after that, he came in at 12:45 on a Wednesday, and he walked across the lobby, and he stepped into my car. He did not state a destination. He stood beside the console and he looked at the dial. He said, "Tell me what happens if you turn the wheel to one of these unmarked positions." I said, "I don't know, sir. The procedure doesn't permit it." He said, "But you've never tried." I said, "No, sir." He said, "In 68 years, no one has ever tried." I said, "Not that I know of, sir." He said, He stood there for another moment, and then he stepped off the car, and he walked across the lobby and out the side door. I called Mrs. Adler the next morning. She was quiet for a long time after I told her. Then she said, "He's going to ride the car. He's going to do it within the next 2 weeks. When he does, he's going to ask you to take it to one of the unmarked positions. You will tell him that the procedure does not permit it. He will tell you that he is your supervisor and that he is authorizing it. At that point you will call me. You will tell him you need to call your superior to confirm the authorization. He will object. You will insist. Do you understand?" I said I did. She said, "If he forces the issue, if he physically takes the controls, if he does anything to override your operation of the car, you will leave the car. Do you understand? You will turn the lever to neutral. You will set the wheel to L. You will step out into the lobby, and you will leave the car to him. You will go to the booth, and you will stay in the booth. You will not get back in the car for any reason, even if he calls for help, even if you hear him screaming. Do you understand?" I said I did. My mouth had gone dry. I had not thought until that moment that this was a job in which I might one day be told to ignore the screaming of my supervisor. She said, "Mr. Halverson is not, I believe, a malicious man. He is a curious man, and he is a man who has come into a position that has historically required a particular kind of incuriosity. He may yet find that incuriosity. I hope he does. But if he doesn't, the procedure has provisions for what comes next, and I want you to be clear that those provisions do not require your participation. Your only obligation is to the boundary. Do you understand?" I said I did. She said, "I'm sorry." That was the only time in all my dealings with her that she ever apologized to me for anything. That conversation was 11 days ago. Mr. Halverson rode the car last night. He came into the lobby at 1:12 in the morning. He was wearing his usual dark suit. He was carrying a leather portfolio. He walked across the marble and he stopped in front of the open doors of the car and he said, "Good evening. I'd like to take a ride." I said, "Of course, sir. What floor?" He said, "I'd like to start by going up to 41, the mechanical floor. I want to check on something." I took him to 41. The doors opened onto the mechanical corridor, which was concrete and pipework and the low industrial hum of the building's systems. He stepped off. He walked around for perhaps 4 minutes. He came back. He stepped into the car. He said, "Thank you. Now I'd like to go down to sub-basement 2. I took him to SB2. The doors opened onto a low concrete corridor lit by a single fluorescent fixture. He stepped off. He walked perhaps 30 feet down the corridor and stopped at a door. He tried the handle. The door did not open. He came back to the car. He said, "Thank you. Now I'd like to try one of the unmarked positions." I said, "Sir, the procedure does not permit it." He said, "I'm aware of the procedure. I'm authorizing a deviation. I'm your supervisor, and I'm telling you that for the purposes of this single ride, I am authorizing a deviation from the procedure. I will sign whatever documentation is required. The responsibility is mine." I said, "I'd like to call my superior to confirm the authorization, sir." He said, "I am your superior." I said, "I'd like to call Mrs. Adler." He paused. He looked at me. He had, I realized, been expecting this. He said, "Mrs. Adler is retired. She has no authority in this building." I said, "Mrs. Adler told me to call her if anyone ever asked me to deviate from the procedure. She told me this in writing." This was not strictly true. She had told me in person, and the card with her number was in my wallet. But I felt that the situation called for a small fortification. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Make your call. I'll wait." I stepped out of the car. I walked across the lobby to the phone in the alcove. I dialed the number. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "He's here. He's in the car. He wants to go to an unmarked position." She said, "Which one?" I said, "He hasn't specified." She said, "Ask him." I walked back across the lobby. I stood at the doors of the car. He was inside, standing beside the console. I said, "Mrs. Adler would like to know which position you intend to ride to." He said without hesitation, "Floor C." I went back to the phone. I said, "C." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Tell him no. Tell him the procedure does not permit it. Tell him that I am instructing you, as the senior employee with knowledge of the procedure, to refuse the request. If he insists, you leave the car. Do you remember what I told you?" I said I did. She said, "I'm going to make some calls. Stay in the lobby. Do not get back in the car. If he operates the car himself, you stay in the booth until I or someone I send arrives. Do you understand?" I said I did. I hung up. I walked back to the car. He was still standing beside the console. He had not moved. I said, "Sir, I'm not authorized to take the car to that position. Mrs. Adler has instructed me to refuse the request." He said, "Mrs. Adler is retired." I said, "Yes, sir, but she's the source of the procedure I'm trained on, and she's instructed me to refuse. I'm going to ask you to step out of the car." He looked at me. His face was perfectly composed. He said, "I'm going to operate the car myself." I said, "Sir, the car requires a trained operator. The mechanism is not safe for an untrained user." He said, "I've reviewed the manual. I'm comfortable with the controls. Step away from the car, please." I stepped back. I stepped out of the car. I walked to the booth. I sat down in Mr. Petrak's chair, with my back to the elevator, the way Mrs. Adler had told me to sit if the doors ever opened on their own. I did not turn around. I did not watch. I heard the doors close. I heard the cables engage. I heard the car begin to descend. I sat in the booth for a long time. I do not know how long. It might have been 5 minutes. It might have been 20. The lobby was perfectly silent except for the very faint sound of the cables in the shaft, the small mechanical breathing of the building, the way the air conditioning sighed in its ducts. I sat with my hands flat on the wooden surface of the booth, and I looked at the green marble of the floor, and I counted my breaths. At some point the cables stopped moving. The shaft was silent. I did not turn around. A long time after that, I do not know how long, the side door of the lobby opened. I heard footsteps on the marble. They were not the footsteps of Mr. Halverson. They were lighter, slower. They came across the lobby and stopped beside the booth. A voice I did not recognize said, "You can stand up, it's all right." I stood up. I turned around. There was a man in the lobby, perhaps 60, in a dark coat, carrying a small black bag. Behind him, Mrs. Adler was standing by the side door. She nodded at me once. The man with the bag walked to the west elevator. The doors were closed. The dial was at L. He pressed his palm flat against the brass of the doors, the way Mrs. Adler had pressed her palm against the wall on the 34th floor almost 2 years ago. He stood there for perhaps a minute. Then he stepped back. He turned to Mrs. Adler, and he nodded. Mrs. Adler walked across the lobby. She stopped in front of me. She said, "Are you all right?" I said I was. I don't know if it was true. She said, "Mr. Halverson will not be returning. The car will need to remain out of service tonight. Mr. Petrak will arrive at his usual time. You should go home. Take the rest of the week off, with pay. We'll talk on Monday." I said, "What happened to him?" She looked at me for a long time. Her face was the same face it had always been, the same severe, kind, exhausted face I'd been looking at for almost 2 years. She said, "He went to the floor he asked to go to. The car came back without him. I don't know what happens on those floors. Nobody who works in this building knows. The whole point of the procedure is that nobody has to know. He decided he had to know. The procedure has provisions for what happens when someone decides that. The provisions work the way they were designed to work." I said, "Did he know?" She said, "Did he know what?" I said, "Did he know what would happen?" She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "I think he knew that something would happen. I don't think he knew what it would be. I think he believed, the way curious men often believe, that whatever it was, he would be the one to come back from it. I have known 3 men in my life who believed that about this building. None of them came back." She put her hand on my arm. It was the only time she had ever touched me. Her hand was very thin and very cold. She said, "Go home, sleep. We'll talk on Monday." I went home. I slept 11 hours. I woke up in the late afternoon and I sat at my kitchen table and I tried to write down what had happened and I found that I could not. The words on the page kept refusing to be the words I needed. I have spent the last 2 days trying. This is the closest I have come. Today is Sunday. I go in tomorrow night for what Mrs. Adler called our talk. I do not know what she will say. I do not know whether she is asking me to stay or asking me to leave. I do not know whether I want to stay or to leave. I have $11,000 in savings now, and the tooth is fixed and the rent is paid through the end of the year. And I am not the man I was 2 years ago when I sat in her office and signed the paperwork. The man I am now has stood at the boundary twice. The man I am now has heard the sound of weight shifting on the other side of doors that were not supposed to open. The man I am now has counted his breaths while something that was not breathing stood 2 feet behind him in a wooden car 100 years old. I think I will go in tomorrow. I think I will keep the job. I have thought about this for 2 days, and the reasoning I keep coming back to is the reasoning of the procedure itself. The building has an agreement with the people who work in it, and the agreement holds. Most of the time. And the people who hold up their side of it are people who are doing real work. Work that has mattered for almost 70 years. Work that someone has to do. Mr. Halverson did not understand the agreement. Mrs. Adler understood it. Mr. Petrak understands it. I think I understand it now in a way I did not before. The understanding is not a comfortable one. It is the understanding of a man who has stood at a fence line and seen, through a gap in the fence, the eyes of something that was watching him without expression, and who has decided, having seen those eyes, that the fence is worth maintaining. The list Mrs. Adler showed me had 12 names on it. 3 had marks beside them. 9 did not. I think about that list often. I think about the 9 names without marks. I wonder what their last shifts were like. I wonder if they were like Mr. Halverson, or if they were like me, and whether the difference is something a person decides or something the building decides for them. I think, when I go in tomorrow, I will ask Mrs. Adler whether my name has been added to the list yet, and whether there is a mark beside it. I do not know what I will do with the answer. I do not know if she will tell me the truth. I do not know if there is a truth to tell, or only a procedure, and a building, and a long brass dial that keeps moving past 41 into a section of the arc where there are no numbers, and the soft, dull sound of a bell, in the dark, at 1 in the morning, ringing for a floor that does not exist. I will leave the lever in neutral. I will leave the wheel at L. I will sit on the velvet bench. I will face the rear of the car. I will count my breaths. That is the agreement. That is all I know.